It's Radio Free 501c, the voice of Rogue Tulips Consulting. I'm Cecilia Sapp. Don't forget to subscribe. We're on all your favorite podcast services. This week, I'm joined by the Michaels, Michael Butera of Association Activision and Michael Wyland of Sumption and Wyland. And we have a great topic to kick off the fourth quarter for you. Eliminate the Executive Committee and Other Heresies. Welcome to episode 212. Hey everybody, it's Monday, October 2nd. It's the beginning of the fourth quarter of the year. Are you ready? We have a great topic to kick off your fourth quarter. Today, we're going to be talking about eliminating the Executive Committee and Other Heresies. Hi, I'm your host, Cecilia Sapp. I'm the principal and founder of Rogue Tulips Consulting. Welcome to everyone, and I want to send a special greeting to our global audience. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, wherever you may be. And thanks again to everyone for joining us this week. This week, I am joined by two of my longtime friends and colleagues, who I like to call the Michaels, Michael Butera and Michael Wyland. They're here to share their thoughts on this topic. They say they agree, but we'll find out in the conversation. So, Michael B., Mr. Butera, would you like to say hello and tell our audience a little about yourself?
Well, thank you very much, Cecilia. It's great to be on a program with Michael W. As you know, I have my own consultancy, and I'm very proud to be a member of the Rogue Tulips Network as well. I specialize in governance and working on the future thinking that's necessary for associations. So with that in mind, I'll pass it off to our good friend, Michael Wyland.
Yeah, please.
Well, I'm Michael Wyland. I practice consulting with my wife and partner, Margaret Sumption, as we have for 33 years, working with nonprofit organizations and associations on board governance and strategic planning for hospitals. And we try to limit our strategic planning to hospitals. And we also do executive coaching. The big thing for us is everything that happens inside the boardroom, whether it's between board members or between the board and the CEO, or the CEO in particular. We really try to work in that environment to try to resolve conflict and improve function and overall organizational health.
Outstanding. And it's great to have you both back, and it's great to have you both on at the same time. So let's jump into this topic, the Executive Committee. And I think everybody who's in the know knows we're talking about the Executive Committee of the Board of Directors. So they do a lot of things in between board meetings, and sometimes they just do a lot of things. So why should we eliminate the Executive Committee? Over to Butera.
Well, the first and foremost reason for ending what has been the tradition, I believe, is because it diminishes the board as a whole. Mm-hmm. Individual board of director members are often thought of as rubber stamps for what the executive committee does. This is just a lunacy kind of thing. And with the availability of all the modern technology we have, this idea that you need to convene a very small group in between meetings, has passed its time. We now have the capacity through technology to do so much more than we've ever done before. And I could go on and on about how it diminishes the board as a whole, but I'd like to pass on some initial words to our friend Michael.
Well, thank you. I mean, I agree with everything you said. And I think what happens to board members, particularly those not on the executive committee, is that they become disenfranchised, and separated from the core work of the board. And what happens in that case is you have people who are recruited, hopefully at least in part for their passion for mission and their desire to be involved and to affect change. And these people are not being given the opportunity to do that in a meaningful way. And what happens is they tend to turn off and walk away, because if their talents can't be used on this board, there are other boards that are ready and willing and desiring those talents on their boards. Mm-hmm. And so the organization loses a lot of its intellectual capital and energy when it disenfranchises a significant number of its leaders. And that's what happens when the executive committee tends to take over or lead, quote unquote, the core work of the organization.
Well, and I would also think those are all excellent points. And having worked with boards as well, I agree because the executive committee ends up running everything. And the other board members, of course, as you've both so well stated, say, what the heck am I doing here? I could be home binge watching Ballers on Netflix, right? So it's like,
Right.
why am I even in this room? They may not even be motivated to go volunteer somewhere else.
Mm-hmm.
And when we're looking at this again, you've probably both heard me go on what I like to call Cecilia's soapbox sometimes about 19th and 20th century models being applied in today's world. In Butera, you already mentioned all the wonderful technology we have now. And the executive committee came at a time when we didn't have all that technology and we didn't get together as easily or quickly as we do now. So do you think it is time? I mean, what's the argument? How can we? And I want to ask Butera first. And okay, in audience, you might be thinking I'm being rude calling them by their last names, but they're both named Michael. So that's why we're doing that. And also, I'm from Missouri. That's just like how we talk to each other. So, so Butera, what's a good argument to say to a board? Because this is going to be a startling thing, like the pandemic lockdown. How could we convince people to get rid of the executive committee?
Well, let me make two arguments. The first one, I'm not an attorney, but I think most people know that each member director is equally responsible in a fiduciary way for what the board does. So if you just rubber stamp what the executive committee did, and you don't take the opportunity to do the proper questioning, the proper oversight, the proper insight that's essential to your role as a director, you could very well be creating your own legal problems, not only for you, but for the association as well. So that's point one. The second one is that I think it diminishes the idea of building strong director boards because the board members often don't get the kind of professional development that's essential to really being strategic thinkers as well as strategic planners. We're very good at this idea of the strategic plan. Michael mentioned that a little bit ago. What I really worry about with the strategic plan in too many organizations these days is that it really becomes a beautiful set of words on a very nice document that nobody does jack what with. So I really think that we need to emphasize this idea of directors being strategic thinkers as well as strategic planners, and the executive committee takes the thinking away from them. So it's time for the executive committee to say so long.
Excellent. So, Mr. Wyland, what do you think of that?
No, I absolutely agree. I would say that there is a benefit to the organization of having access to more information, more perspective, more diversity, of viewpoint, of input. And I think that I served on a national foundation board about 20 years ago. And I remember having a telephone conversation with the executive director. And one of my concerns was that he was not spending a lot of time cultivating his foundation board members. And I stated this to him as politely as I could, but directly. And his response, I thought, was very telling. He said, "Yeah, I need to do more with my executive committee team." That's not what I said.
No,
and
not at
it
all.
becomes one of the things that the executive committee often becomes is a crutch or a safe space for the CEO or executive director. It's a lot easier to corral 4 or 5 people than it is 15. The executive committee of 4 or 5 or the entire board of 15. Yeah, I'm going to deal with these 4 or 5 people because we can sit around a single table and talk. It's a little bit tougher to do that with the full board. I can build a relationship with a few people, but not with the entire board. And that is another way that that the organization disenfranchises members of the board who are not on the executive committee. And that is a danger, again, not only for the individual board members who, as Michael Butera says, have a fiduciary duty and a legal obligation equal to that of the officers of the corporation. But they just, they have to be a part of the process in order to know what they're doing and be able to do it and do it well.
Exactly.
Permit me to add a couple of things here. First, all of us have committed sins in this business. I've been an executive director and a CEO a number of times, and I really enjoyed working with my executive committees for all the wrong reasons. It wasn't that I didn't like them, I didn't get to know them. It was that it was easier. Easier isn't the point. Right. It's effectiveness that we want to have. So we substitute a kind of unnecessary efficiency in the modern world for a real important effectiveness. And in terms of other sins, so to speak, when someone who is an executive or an officer says, well, there are just too many board members for everybody to get to know one another and participate, then the question is, why is the board that size?
Exactly.
Maybe the board size is out of kilter. And that's another thing we have to talk about these days, because the idea that, more board members equates to, more engagement probably is not true.
That's right. And I'm sitting here thinking, what chief staff executive would say, I am not going to build relationships with the entire board, because who do they think is going to become the executive committee later on? Right. Who's going to move into those leadership positions? And I have been a chief staff executive. I had something of a relationship with every board member. I had some relationships with our chapters in that organization. I have run large chapter networks or affiliate networks. I once ran a chapter network with 46 chapters, one of which was in Europe. I had a relationship with at least one person at every chapter. So it can be done. Are you going to have that in-depth daily or weekly contact with all those people? No, but yes, you can get to know everybody a little bit. And again, you should, because if you're the chief staff executive, you need to be looking ahead. That's the strategic part of your job. And who is going to be on my board in 3 years? Not who's on my board now, not who is the executive committee now, because frankly, your executive committee now is like data. Once it's written down, is old and useless. Well, and did I say that out loud? Oh my God. Okay.
Well, one thing I wanted to point out is, that there is a positive benefit for a chief staff executive to be involved with their board. Compass Point did a survey about 10 or 12 years ago. And one of the questions, or two of the questions, were how much of the chief staff executive's time is spent working on governance? And then the question was, how satisfied is the board with the CEO, and how satisfied is the CEO with their role vis-a-vis the board? And it was really interesting. There was a synergy that if the CEO, chief staff officer, spent approximately 20% of their time on governance activities, what happened was the CEO and the board members were both far happier with the relationship than if they spent either less time or more time. Mm-hmm. Now, I can hear a lot of CEOs saying, oh my God, I don't have enough time to spend 20% of it on my board. But there is a payback for that in terms of increased satisfaction, both for you and for your board members, which is important to remember, because the same Compass Point survey said 10% of all CEOs are currently seeking other employment. Mm-hmm. And 90% of CEOs don't expect to be in the same position 5 years from now. And the other part of the survey indicated that 1/3 of all separations of CEOs from nonprofits are involuntary.
And what do you think is driving that, the involuntary separation? Is it just the board dynamics, which I know we've all been a victim of at least once? Mm-hmm.
Well, let me say that there's multiple reasons, some of which could be the fault of the executive, just doing something stupid. and not believing that it is. On the other hand, a lot of it's what we're talking about. They have no full relationship with the board as a whole. So if you get a couple officers who want more and more control on the daily functions, which are not their business,
right,
it doesn't take very long before the tension rises and the executive committee says to the whole board, well, this just isn't working. Well, is it not working for the board, or is it not working for that officer or that group of officers? So officers have a responsibility, but the responsibility isn't the one that they currently have. Their responsibility, in my judgment, ought to be building the director's capacity and competencies, and being better listeners and collaborators with their board. Their job is not to tell the board, this is what we're going to do. And I think that over time, the executive committee has just assumed too much power. And directors have let them do it, to be candid. And so have executives. That time is over. This is not the 20th century. It's the 21st century. And times are changing and the environment is different. Time for us to move on and do some new things.
Yeah, well said. We need to modernize our governance structures, most definitely. So we promised the audience other heresies. I've already made a nasty remark about data. So, what are some of these other heresies that we could discuss? Like, for example, we've talked about how chief staff executives are often pushed out of their job for no good reason. I remember when I lost my job, I started talking to other chief staff executives and they said, oh, we all get fired at least once, if not twice. And it's usually not because of performance.
right.
It's because somebody didn't like me or somebody wanted my job. And so one person I spoke to a couple of years ago who had been in a similar situation said, and there's no one for us to go to report our board for behaving badly.
Right.
So unless you want to drop a dime to the IRS, which I don't think we want to do because we want them looking at us, right? We want to stay under the radar. But so what is that a heresy that our CSEs in our profession should have someone to go to?
Well, I think I think there are a couple of related points that I want to make. One is that one of my heresies is to say that strong boards don't fire CSEs. Weak boards do.
Ooh, I like that.
And the relationship between a board and a chief executive or chief staff officer should be a partnership of strong equals. And when it is not, when either the CEO or the board are weak in their execution of their duties and responsibilities, that's when you run into the personalities, the turf issues, the communication deficits that lead to things like unpredicted or sudden leadership changes. And that can be, yes, the CEO can be fired. But it's amazing how often when the CEO gets fired, about a third of the board resigns about the same time.
Yeah, I here's another point where Michael and I agree. I think he's right on point with each of the items he said, as well as you were, Cecilia. Let me just add, in this new world that we're in, one of the other things that I think we need to take a strong look at with boards. For years and years and years, we elect boards, particularly in the professional society area, based on geography. We have a regions, whatever we call them. And I have to ask myself, well, do we think that talent is equally determined by geographic distribution? I don't think so. Another way to look at it is, in terms of our need for DEI. Are we going to achieve a well-balanced board in terms of demography, demographics, ethnicity, just because of regional geography? I don't think so. But when we start saying to one another, well, maybe just electing people by geographic region isn't the right way to do it. then people say, oh, you're anti-democratic. There's nothing anti-democratic about it. All we're doing is applying a governance model that we learned as a result of the way our government works. And then you have to ask the obvious question: just how well is the government working under that system?
Well, right.
I recognize that we do need diversification, but
Hmm.
will elections, in the way we're doing them now, provide us with the kind of diversification of demographics, thought, intelligence, and capacity that we're looking for to have strong, capable, well-functioning boards of directors?
And see, in my practice, I run across a lot of organizations that are still trying to select board members based on name. Who do we want to be on the board? And instead of saying, what role or roles do we need to fulfill? What gaps do we have in our board leadership? And how do we fill those gaps? Once we know what the profile is for the kind of board member or board members we need, and whether we're talking about geography, whether we're talking about DEI, whether we're talking about, other criteria, once we know what those criteria are and identify them, then we can go out and vet people who might be appropriate, who meet those criteria. But one of my heresies is, and this is more true in the C3 world than in the C6 world, is we got to get away from recruiting personalities and get more towards recruiting roles.
We have to do that. I agree.
Absolutely.
We need to look at the skills. Yeah.
No.
Because when you're looking at that, and when you were sharing all those good comments, Wyland, I was like, we really need to also be clear about, do we have a money board or a working board? So, and I think a C3 wants to have a money board more than they want a working board, because they need people who can not only write a check, but can get other people to write you checks. That's a very different skill set than a working board, where maybe the board is actually stepping in a smaller organization and actually doing some of the work. That
I object to both of those terms.
Okay.
Because to me, a working board is for a startup organization that doesn't yet have staff capacity. And a money board, is often disengaged from the operations and the strategy. They're there because they were recruited to write checks. What my goal is to promote governing boards, who are neither working boards nor money boards. Where I say, yes, every board member should make a meaningful charitable gift if you're in a charitable organization, or if you're on an association board that has an associated foundation, and many associations do. Yes, board members should be supporters. They should be able to identify where the resources are coming from, but that's very different from being a money board. Mm-hmm. I think money boards are a really bad idea. I think working boards are a necessary evil when you're getting started. But I think the goal should be to move towards a governing board that has the eye on strategy, on resources, the broader perspective and the longer term.
That's a really good point. And I have to say, I like that better. That's the ideal, the governing board. But I also think we need all three terms, because we need to know what kind of board culture we're dealing with. Right. So who is our board? What kind of board? What is their mindset? Because let's be honest, there's some people, they just want to write you a big check so that they can say their name is on the board. And there are people like that. And is that a bad thing? I don't think so. If you're a group that needs money, if you're a group that needs people to donate money and help you find other people to donate money, that's not necessarily a bad thing. But no, I do agree with that. I like the governing board concept the best. And that's the problem. And this isn't quite a heresy. It's really just stating the obvious. But that's the problem with the nonprofit world right now, is we don't have enough governing boards. We have too many people bringing their emotional baggage into the boardroom, not putting their head in the game and saying, I'm in here to represent everybody and not just my chapter or not just my region. I am here on behalf of everyone. We have that big problem. Another thing that some people might consider a heresy, just because you work in that profession or industry does not mean you are qualified to run your professional organization. or trade organization. And some people are going to say that's a heresy. That was something that was changed for the CAE qualifications a few years ago. If you came from the industry, you only had to work in a nonprofit for 1 year, not 5 like everybody else.
Mm-hmm.
So that is really just a slap in the face to everybody else, in my opinion. I've said that, and I'll say it here on the record. They'll dig it up 500 years from now and go, okay, that was what she thought. But that is wrong, because if our profession is going to have any integrity, we cannot keep promoting the concept that anyone can do it. Because like I used to work at an association for otolaryngologists, and I would just tell them, you would never ask me to do ear surgery, and I wouldn't ask you to run an association of any kind of nonprofit. And so that's really a thing that actually is heretical currently in our profession and has been for a number of years. We're not supposed to say that. We're not supposed to speak up and say, no, just because you're a doctor doesn't mean you can run an association. And I think we have seen many people fail in that role because they didn't understand what the job was and they didn't understand it. And that brings us back to all the wonderful points you both have been making about board training, board recruitment, and knowing that we want to create a culture of a governing board that actually understands their role and responsibility. And so that is something of a heresy because we're not saying what's in the book. We're not speaking the good word of the good book, right? So,
yep.
Well, language is important, and it's interesting that you use the phrase running, because some people think that running means owning. And I mean owning in a different sense than ownership of a collaborative. When they hear the word running, they say, well, I run this organization. No, they don't run the organization, right. They steward the organization. Mm-hmm. Their responsibility is to ensure that when they leave, that they leave the organization better than it was and prepared for a new future. And far too many people don't leave. That's another heresy. You right. know, and it's particularly true in the C3 world. They just stay around forever.
Hey, I have one client hospital that had a board member who was on the board for 42 years. And it was awfully difficult to try to explain that, maybe you need to turn over a little bit more often, because when you brought that person on at age 40, he was very important and very necessary. Now he's 82. Maybe we should give him the golden handshake and give him the plaque and throw a party for him and, let him retire from this board service. When we're talking about diversity on boards, I think that that chronological age should be one of the diversifying factors, because there are, yes, there are a lot of boards with old white men on them. I can say that out loud. And we can talk about gender and we can talk about ethnicity, but we should also be talking about age. And that doesn't mean we recruit a bunch of children. What it means is we bring people in who are early career and mid-career, as well as those who are, senior service. Really try to diversify the viewpoints in the boardroom, and that'll make the board more responsive and more understanding of the membership or the stakeholders, whatever group that they are trying to work with.
And let's not codify that in the bylaws.
No,
some groups do that. They codify, we must have a young professional chair. And then it's in the bylaws. So you have to do it, where that should really be in policies and procedures for the nominating committee. We want to seek diverse representation of all the members we have, because diversity is not just what we look like or where we come from. It is our experience. It's our knowledge. It's our, strange yet unique take on the world. Maybe we see things really differently. Been having a lot of conversations on neurodiversity lately, and I think making sure that is included, because neurodiversity is part of diversity. And yet, I recently had a guest, Cynthia Lockery, on the show talking about it. And she said that she's been talking to some DEI people, and they're like, what? Neurodiversity? It's like, it's diversity. It's people who think differently. Or maybe they've been diagnosed with something like ADD or ADHD or maybe they're on the autism spectrum, or maybe they have one of the 3Ds, as she called it, dyslexia, dysgraphia, dyscalculia. So we all have these things that maybe people can't see, and we have to try to find a way to find those things out about each other. And gee, the power of the question, right? Just asking people, like, what do you need to succeed? What do you need to do this job? What do you need to learn so that you can grow and build your knowledge base? And so fulfilling all of those things takes time and thought, but it takes a lot less time in the long run than cleaning up messes by people who don't really understand why they're there. And I'm not saying they're doing it for necessarily ill intent. Some people do, but that's not really the norm. I think most of the time things go wrong because people don't know what they're doing.
Well, let me mention one more heresy, that will probably drive a few people crazy.
Yay.
It's one word: bylaws.
Mm-hmm.
When I work with an organization that has a set of bylaws that goes on for pages and pages and pages and pages and pages, there is something wrong here, because much of that doesn't belong. We obviously need appropriate operating procedures and policies, but all of those shouldn't be enshrined in bylaws for the very reason you mentioned. Once you put them in bylaws, it's mandatory, period, end, finish. And I must admit, I was working with an organization recently. I pointed out 10 items in their bylaws that they never do.
Wow.
They just never do. Well, some of them, when you have a 45-page set of bylaws, it's kind of hard to find everything,
Yeah.
So we need some simplicity, not simplistic, some simplicity, and overall understanding that the bylaws should be a general set of guides that fulfill the appropriate rules wherever they're incorporated, state or in the District of Columbia. But it's not a place to make sure that your pet peeve is done year in and year out.
That's right. Oh my gosh. People put way too much in the bylaws. I agree. And
Yeah.
way too much in meeting minutes. That was one of the lessons I learned early in my career. Is one of my bosses said to me, you've done a really great job. They're so detailed, but you need to take most of this out. So 2 words that I learned early on: discussion ensued. Capture.
Right.
They talked about it and then they decided something, but you don't put in, you don't want to show how the sausage is made.
No, I had someone who said that the purpose of meeting minutes is to describe what was done, not what was said.
Love that. That is great. I haven't heard that one before.
I like that too.
I have a possible approach, for people who believe that the executive committee is the location where, well, this is where we take care of board stuff. And, Board Source, which used to be the National Center for Nonprofit Boards, advocates a model where rather than an executive committee, you have a governance committee. And it's set up very similar to the way you would have a finance committee or a programs committee or an operations committee or a fundraising committee, whatever kind of committee you might need. But the purpose of the governance committee is the care and feeding of the board of directors. And, it's policy and procedure specific to the board and the board's relationship with the CEO. It is where leadership development is addressed. It's where board succession is addressed. How are we doing our leadership development? How and where are we recruiting new board members? Are we administering a process for selecting or electing? That can come through the governance committee. And borrowing from my healthcare clientele, it has to do with the hygiene of the board. All the other committees really work with the organization as a whole, but the governance committee works with the board specifically. And that's how and the governance committee does not have to be officers. It can be anyone who shares an interest in the effective running of the governance of the organization.
Hey, Michael, it sounds like we need some soap and water.
Oh my gosh, that's great. Well, this has been so fun. We three heretics knocking the legs out from under some of our age-old beliefs here. Love this conversation. And, frankly, we just don't need the executive committee anymore. Whether you want to accept that or not. It's like we just don't need it anymore. I love the governance idea. So I wish we could talk longer, but we'd be here for another 3 days. So we're going to have to wrap up this episode for this week. I want to thank the Michaels for joining me for what's always fun conversation between the three of us. So I'm going to throw it over to Michael Butera and ask Michael to share the one thought he'd like the audience to take away today and how people can get in touch with him if they want to share their own heresies.
The most important thing that we did today was told people to think that it's not the 20th century. It's time to govern in a new and modern way. A quarter of a century is gone. It's time for us to think of new ways to govern. If you want to get in touch with me, the best way is to I'll give you my direct email. It's Michael B at associationactivision.com. And let me add my thanks to Cecilia and Michael Wyland for their excellent comments here today.
Oh, thank you, Michael. And Michael Wyland, would you like to share a closing thought and how people can get in touch with you?
Absolutely. Thank you, Cecilia. Thank you, Michael. This has been so much fun. And if it went on for another 3 days, I'd be here for every minute of it. I guess, my parting thought really is that each individual board member has equal value and equal responsibility for being involved actively in the governance of their organization. And don't let anyone tell you that you don't have that responsibility and that opportunity. Don't let anyone pat you on the head and tell you to go sit in the corner for the next 3 years. That's not why you were put in charge, and that's what happened. You were put in charge of the governance of this organization. And to get in contact with me, I have a LinkedIn profile and all that stuff, and also a website, www.sumptionandwyland.com, and the AND is spelled out. And my email address is michael@sumptionandwyland.com. I'd be glad to talk to you.
Great. And you should check out the Wyland and Sumption blog because it's always full of interesting ideas like why we need to get rid of the executive committee. That's where the whole conversation started. So thank you again to my guest, the Michaels, Michael Butera and Michael Wyland. We have to go rogue for now, but we'll be back next time with another exciting episode. So don't forget to subscribe. If you'd like to learn more about Rogue Tulips Consulting and how we can help your organization bloom outside the box, check out our website, roguetulips.com. If you don't see what you're looking for on the services page, give me a call and we'll talk. And if you're looking for continuing education for nonprofit management executives, whether you're getting ready for an exam or you're looking for CE for a renewal process, check out our education program. It's so big. It has its own website, the 501cleague.net. Check that out too. So on behalf of myself and Michael, thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next time.